The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and good morning, everybody. My name is Nick Cortina, and I'm excited to bring you another great Exago support lab today, this time all about date check custom functions in Exago. And we've got a whole bunch of different functions to show you today, lots of great stuff. But before we do get started, I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me and see my screen all right. So if you could just type a Y or a yes in the questions box, and it looks like we all know the drill. We're seeing those Ys and those yeses come through. That's awesome. So again, my name is Nick Cortina, here with Exago to bring you another great support lab today. We're going to be talking all about date check custom functions. And just to give you a little bit of an idea of exactly what we're going to talk about, there's 3 custom functions in particular that we're going to review today. And as one quick aside, all of these custom functions are currently available on our support site for you guys to access. So following the lab, if you'd like to take any of the sample code of the items that we've used, all of that will be available there for you folks. Those 3 custom functions are first going to be our year-to-date check. So this is going to be useful for whenever we need to do any type of year-to-date calculations, whether that be, summing some given field, doing a count of some other field or something like that. Those would be good instances to use this first year-to-date check function. Very similarly, we're going to have a last year-to-date check function, and this is going to be particularly useful when we want to do year-over-year calculations and things of that nature. And finally, in addition to those first 2 functions, we're also going to be taking a look at this month check function that we've designed, which will allow us to do things like check if a given date field is within a specified month or month to date. And then in the same manner that we'll use the year to date and last year to date functions, we can add that to a conditional aggregate to do some sums or counts of values within a given month or a month to date as well. Now, one quick thing I do want to mention here, as we are going to be taking a look at some custom functions, we are going to be diving into a little bit of code today. So if anybody, doesn't necessarily want to see code or might be, not quite as interested in that sort of content, that is the direction we're going to be moving in today. So I just want to make sure that we're all aware of that up front. The last thing I want to mention here is our next support lab is going to be on September 12th, and that's going to be all about different formatting tips within the Exago Designer. We're actually going to be leveraging one of our graphic designers here who really has an eye for making reports look nice within the Exago interface. So be sure to tune in for some tips and tricks on how to really make those reports look great in your environment. So on that note, I'm going to jump over to Exago and we'll get started. So here, we'll notice that I've got this pre-built report structure that we're going to use, and there's a couple things going on in the report that I wanted to start off with. So before we go any farther, I'm going to give you folks just a quick overview of what I've already designed, and then we can start jumping in and see how we can really take this to the next level and apply some of these different custom functions that we mentioned just previously. So to start things off, we've got a simple report here. We've got just a nice detail section that's going to output some given content for us by way of what we call our current order dates. So as many of you folks know, we oftentimes leverage the Northwind data set. And so what I've gone ahead and done is actually modified those given order dates by using an Exago custom column. And so all this is going to do for us is it's going to make those dates seem a little more current. That way the examples that we're going to look at will actually evaluate, right? As primarily the Northwind data set is all from the 90s, it'll help us a little bit to bump those years up a little so we can check if things are actually in this year to date, in last year to date, or in a given month that is going to be a little bit closer to where we are right now. In addition to this current order date that we're going to be using, we're also just going to display this revenue field. And again, this is actually a custom column behind the scenes, but all this is doing is multiplying the quantity and the unit price of our order details category so that we can have this final revenue number. And we're going to use that for some of these calculations that we'll see in just a moment. Now, you'll notice a couple spots where we're going to fill in some of this good stuff as we dig into these custom functions, but we've also just got a simple revenue total. So that way we have a baseline comparison for something to look at as we start developing these year-to-date, last year-to-date, and potentially a June 2018 revenue totals as well. And we're also going to partition that revenue out into this year and last year. And so before I go any further, I think this is actually a good place to just take a quick look at what this complete formula structure looks like. So we're using a couple functions here together to generate what we call a conditional sum. And just to be clear about exactly what I mean there, we'll first notice that our primary function here is going to be this agsum function. Now, if we were going to simply sum a given field, we would do so just like we are here in cell B7. We would say agsum of the order details revenue, and this would sum that given field across the entire report as it's currently in our report footer section. Now, by contrast, we're doing something similar, but with a little bit of a condition here. So within the agsum, you'll notice that we actually have this if function. Now, an if nested inside of an agsum is how we would use a general structure for any sort of conditional aggregate that we might want to use in Exago. So in this case, to read out loud what this function is actually doing, we're going to sum values of the revenue field wherever the year of the current order date is equal to 2018. So if we bump into any records where the year of the current order date does not equal 2018, instead of supplying the associated revenue value to that agsum function, we'll instead supply a 0. And so in effect, this is creating a conditional sum where we will only see the total of the revenue for orders that had a current order date equal to 2018. By the same token, to calculate our revenue for last year, we'll do an agsum if, again use that year function as the condition for the if here, but this time we're going to compare to see if it's in 2017. So again, looking to calculate last year's revenue. If the year is 2017, we'll add that revenue to our total. Otherwise, we'll add a 0. And again, because these functions are included in that report footer category, that's going to ensure that we're going across all the given records, comparing each one's date to see which of the 2 years they might fall into, and then potentially adding their totals to that conditional sum here. So with all those things in mind, let's just take a quick look at the output as it stands right now. And so we'll notice we're going to see some current dates here starting in July of 2017 with some associated revenue values. And if we flip through a couple pages here, we'll see that we're going to get some 2018 values here as well. And if we keep going, we'll eventually see that we'll also have a couple 2019 values. So in theory, as we begin to design some of these reports, we shouldn't really see any of these values getting added to those totals. If we jump all the way to the end so we can look at the totals in the report footer, we'll notice that the total revenue across all of the given years is stated right here. We have our total revenue from this year and the total revenue from last year as well. So as we start to build out these year-to-date calculations for this year and last year, we should notice that those values should only ever be a subset of the values displayed in the bottom part of the footer here. So at this point, I think we're going to get to a point where we want to actually go ahead and add that year-to-date check calculation to this given report. Now, before we do that, I want to navigate over to my admin console here, and we're going to take a look at the actual year-to-date check function itself. So that way we have a little bit of an idea of how we should actually be utilizing this function in a conditional sum down in that report footer. So in my administration console, I've navigated down to my extensions section. So this is where all of our different custom functions, server events, action events, etc. are going to live. And here I've gone ahead and opened up the 3 different custom functions that we're going to be using today. So we'll notice that here the name for this function is year-to-date check. Pretty intuitive, just a quick sort of one word on what exactly this thing is going to do for us. And the description here is it takes an input date and will return true if it was in this year to date. It's going to return false otherwise. So if we take a quick look at the argument info, we'll notice there's only one argument and it is going to be mandatory. It's not an optional argument here. And that argument will be our input date. And the description here is simply the date to check. If we take a quick look at our code, we're first going to create a Boolean value, and here we've just called this ret value because this is simply going to be what we end up returning at the end of the function call. And our default value here is going to be false, and we'll see that down the road here, if the input date evaluates to be within this year to date, we'll flip this to true. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to actually go ahead and parse that given input date as a date time, and we'll store that as my date here. The next thing we're going to do is grab the first day of the given year. So we'll create a new date time with the properties of the date time being this given year of today. And then we'll manually populate these two one values, and that's going to say, hey, let's go to January 1st of whatever the current year is. So now that we have the first day of whatever given year we're in, and we also have the actual input date, we can now use a conditional here with this if to say if the given input date is greater than or equal to the first day being January 1st of this year, and the given input date is less than or equal to the value of today, we'll modify that return value to be true. Now, if our date doesn't fall within the bounds that we've established here, we're going to maintain the initial value of the ret val, which is false, and return false. So if our input date falls within the bounds of this year to date, as we've defined it here, we'll return a true. And in effect, if we're using that conditional sum that we were talking about before, that ag sum if, now we can use this function as the input to that if to say, hey, sum the values of this field if it's within this year to date. So with the implementation of the function in mind, and now that we have a little bit of an understanding of how we should actually be interacting with this function, I'm going to navigate back to Exago. I'm going to go back to my report designer. I'll just close out that old execution. And let's first populate cell C4. So let's just do a quick simple call to the function to see if the current order date is in this year to date. So with that cell selected, I'm going to hit the f of x icon to open our formula editor. And here, I'm going to start typing year to date. And I'll go ahead and select the year to date check function. And we can see here that we're going to see the actual description of that function along with some information about the arguments, just like we saw in the admin console. And so we know that this is going to take a given input date and return true if it's within this year to date. So with that in mind, let's use those current order dates. And for the purpose of just a simple example of calling this function, we'll add that to C4, and let's just go ahead and give that a quick execute and see what that returns. So looking at some of these initial dates back in 2017, we can see that those are all going to return false as they're not within this year to date. I'll tab through a couple pages so we can get to some of the 2018 values. And we'll start to see that all of those January values going into February, etc., are going to return true as they are within this given year to date. We'll keep tabbing through just a little bit here so we can get to some August values. And we'll notice as we get down in here, if we get to the 22nd of August, that's still going to return true. But then the next values that we see being on the 25th of August, which have not yet happened in this year, are going to return false for the year-to-date check. So as of right now, it looks like it's doing exactly what we anticipated. So let's navigate back to that report designer and let's walk through how we would set this up as a conditional sum, this time down in cell C7, which is in our report footer. So once again, we're going to open up that formula editor. However, this time we're going to start with an ag sum function. And so here, this is saying that we can input a field to sum, but with the examples we were just looking at, we know that we can actually just go ahead and input an if function here. And so now with this if function, the first thing we're defining is the actual condition. This will dictate whether or not we supply our consequent or our alternative to the ag sum. With this in mind, the condition in this case is going to be that year-to-date check function. And once again, we're going to input that current order date. And that's going to be the full condition for the if. Is the current order date within this year-to-date? If it is, we're going to return the consequent. And so in this case, we want that to be our revenue. If it's not within this year to date, we don't want to add anything to the total. So in that case, we'll go ahead and add a 0 for our alternative. Now, at this point, it's beneficial for us to just do a quick check on our closing parentheses. As you know, when we begin to nest functions, it can be kind of easy to lose a sense of exactly where we are. So we can use the Exago highlighting feature here just to make sure that all our parentheses line up, and it looks like they do. And so now that we've set that up correctly, it'd be good for us to just check out our formatting quick, make sure that our decimal places and currency symbol are there. So this looks like a nice numeric value for us. And let's execute that report one more time. And so we've already seen what the actual year-to-date check looks like comparing against each individual date, but let's go take a quick look at the actual new sum that we've got here. So as we can see, our revenue total for the year is just a little over 650,000, but our revenue as of the year-to-date calculation is actually just shy of 400,000. So based on the values that we were seeing before, this seems like a pretty plausible total in terms of the actual year-to-date values here. So at this point, we've successfully added a conditional sum that's going to generate a total for the revenue for this given year to date. Now, at this point, while that's really nice and can be beneficial for us, it might also benefit us to show the revenue for last year to date. And one thing that you might be thinking about right now is, well, hey, if I just need to show my year to date value, could I potentially just add a filter instead of using a custom function? And in that regard, you're absolutely right. We could potentially show this year-to-date value by simply adding a filter and saying first of this year and today. That said, if we potentially wanted to do calculations where we show both year-to-date and last year-to-date on the same report, that's going to be an instance where we can't necessarily use that filter, right? Because if we filter just for this given year to date, then all of a sudden we start to exclude last year to date's values and vice versa. So in that regard, if we want to be able to maintain the full data set on the report, but just display the year to date calculation somewhere, that's going to be really the primary use case for these custom functions. So at this point, our next step is going to be adding this last year to date component. So again, just before we do that, I want to jump back to our admin console for a second, and let's look at the actual last year-to-date check code. Now, going to be very similar to the year-to-date check. We'll notice there's just going to be a slight tweak that we'll make down in the actual code body. But first, we've got our name as last year-to-date check. Our description is takes an input date and returns true if it was in last year-to-date. It'll return false otherwise. And our argument info here is going to be the same as the year-to-date check function. It's just going to be taking an input date. Looking at the code body, we've once again got that return value with a default value of false. We're going to get the input date and parse it as a date time. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to create a first and a last day this time. If we recall, with the year-to-date check, we don't need this last day, because the last day of this year for year to date, at least, is going to always be today. That said, that's maybe not always the case for the last year to date check. And by that, I mean, we can't just say datetime.today because that wouldn't necessarily be correct for last year. So with that in mind, our first day is going to create a new date time using the datetime today year property, but we're actually going to just subtract 1 from that value when we generate the new date time. We'll still use a month and day value of 1 to signify that it's January 1st of last year that we want to generate for the first day bound. And then to generate our last day bound, we'll still again use that datetime today year value, subtracting 1. However, in this case, we're going to use the datetime today month property and the datetime today day property. And that's going to ensure that we'll always get to say, hey, go back 1 year, but still maintain the same values for whatever month and day we're currently in. At this point, we'll do a similar date comparison to what we did in the year-to-date check function. First, comparing the actual input date to see if it was greater than or equal to the first day, being the first day of last year. And then also checking to see if it was less than or equal to the last day, where the last day is defined as today minus 1 year. We'll then set the return value to true if it falls within those bounds, and then go and actually return that value. So with that in mind, let's navigate back to Exago. We'll close out those two executions there. And let's go ahead and add that last year-to-date check to cell D4 so we can see that evaluating against the current order dates. So I'll again open my formula editor. We'll open last year-to-date check, and we'll input that current order date again. And so now that we've added that, we'll give it a quick execute, check out those values, make sure it's returning what we expect. And in this case, for 2017, last year, we can see that all the values prior to August 22nd are going to return true. If we scroll down a little bit here, it looks like on our next page, we'll get to a point where for August 22nd, those values are still coming back as true. But as soon as we hit August 23rd, which would be tomorrow last year, that value is going to return false. So once again, returning what we'd expect with just a simple call to last year-to-date check. Now, with that in mind, let's go ahead and add that conditional sum to cell D7. So doing something very similar to what we're doing in C7 here, but this time with that last year-to-date check. So I'll open that formula editor again, and we'll start with the Exago function. We're once again going to use that if. This is how we are going to do all of our conditional sums or counts with an Exago if. And now, instead of year-to-date check, this time we'll use our last year-to-date check. We'll supply that current order date. We'll have our consequent here, and this time that's again going to be the revenue. And then our alternative will just be a 0. And so once again, it's just a good idea for us to check our parentheses, make sure everything seems to be lining up correctly. And so it is. At this point, we'll go ahead and execute. And one thing that we'll keep in mind here is that since our actual data set doesn't start until July of 2017, I would anticipate that the year-to-date calculation for last year is going to be significantly smaller, and we can see that it is. The total revenue for last year in our data set is just a little over 225,000. Whereas the last year-to-date calculation is going to be just shy of 50,000. So at this point, we've seen how we can both calculate a year-to-date or last year-to-date calculation. But we do have one other custom function that can sort of really be beneficial in terms of, finding out if a value was in any specified month or potentially that given month to date. So what I'd like to do next is jump back to our admin console here, and we're going to look at one more function by way of the month check function. So here, our month check function is going to be able to tell us if a given date value was within either a specified month or a specified month to date. And if we look at the actual arguments for this function, there's going to be a couple more than just the actual input date for this one. Here, we'll see that we first have the input date, but then our next argument is actually going to be the number of months we want to go back from our current month. So as a quick example, if we were to supply a 0, that would mean evaluate for the current month. If we had a value of 2, that would mean 2 months ago. And in the example that we're going to take a look at, we're going to calculate to see what values fall in the range of June 2018. So that would be 2 months ago from today, being that we're currently in August. Finally, we have the final argument here, which is toDate. And this is going to be a Boolean value, meaning it's either true or false. And if we assign it a value of true, that would mean that we're looking for the month to date calculation. If we set it to false, that would mean that we want to take any values that fall within that full given month. Taking a look at the function code, we're going to start in a fairly similar manner in that we've got that return value whose default is going to be false. We'll first parse the actual input date as a date time. We're going to grab the integer value of the number of months back that we'd like to go and store that in this months back variable. We're also going to grab the actual date bound here, and that's going to convert the number of months back and subtract that from today's value. And that'll give us the actual date bound for whatever today's date is minus the number of months that we've supplied to the actual function call. Next, we'll have our toDate Boolean value. Again, that's going to be true to say take the month to date calculation. That's going to say false if we want to show the full month. And then we're going to create this boundary day. And this is going to be either the last day of the month or the current day number if that toDate flag is set. So here we're just using a ternary statement to say, hey, look at the value of toDate, and if it's true, use that date bound day, meaning use whatever the actual day value of today is in that given month. If it's false, we're going to take a look at the number of days in the given month of whatever month we've actually gone back to. And the reason why we need to go in this manner is, as some of you folks are probably aware, not every month is going to have the same number of days. So it's not necessarily always going to be valid for us to take that same given month date calculation here. And so in that regard, if we go back to say February, this days and month function call will ensure that we're not going to compare against, say, February 31st. Now we'll go ahead and create our first and last day bounds in a very similar manner to how we were doing that before. We'll use the year of the actual date bound, the month of the given date bound, and we'll use the first of that given month here, and then we'll use the boundary day to dictate what the last date of that month that we should be comparing against will be. Again, similar to some of the other functions, we're going to compare our input date against that first day to see if it's greater than or equal to. We'll compare against the last day to see if it's less than or equal to there. And if both those conditions evaluate to true, we'll set our return value to true and return. So with this in mind, let's navigate back to our report designer. And let's do a quick month check here, and let's just try to see if we can get the month check function to return true for values of the current order date that fall within June of 2018. So opening my formula editor, I'll go to that month check function. We've got our input date, and that's going to be the current order date. We've got our months back. And so like we were saying before, this is the number of months to subtract from our current month number. So being that today is August and we want to get to June, that means we need to subtract 2. And so our value here will simply be 2. Finally, we have the toDate argument. And so this is going to be set to true if we want the month to date. It's going to be false if we want the full month. So why don't we first try to do this for the month to date calculation? So effectively, this month check should return true for any dates in June that fall within the month to date, meaning any values that are less than or equal to June 22nd and greater than or equal to June 1st, all within 2018. We'll hit OK. And let's execute this report. So we can see that these values are going to appear false, and we can jump forward a few pages just to get to some of those actual June values. And if we scroll down here, we'll notice that as soon as the values start to get into June of 2018, that column is going to start returning true. If we navigate forward another page, we'll get to June 20th here and we'll still see true, but as soon as we hit June 23rd, that value becomes false, meaning the month check function is correctly evaluating the current date values to see if they were within June's month to date. If we were to go back for a second and modify that month check function to instead use a value of false here, if we execute that again, we should now see in the resulting output that values within any given part of June 2018 will evaluate to true. So if we jump forward just a little bit, we'll see true for all of the dates in June, going all the way down to June 30th. And then as soon as we hit values in July, we get returns of false once again. So it's great that we can correctly see the month check working here, but at this point, we'd like to actually be able to generate another conditional sum using that month check function. So navigating to cell E7, let's generate a conditional sum that will show us the total revenue from June of 2018. So here we'll use agsum and if, again using that same structure that we've seen in some of the other formulas. This time we're going to use the month check. We've got our input date being that current order date. Our months back is going to be 2 as we're going back to June. Our to date, and in this case, let's first do this as a June month to date calculation sum. So we'll supply a true value here. We'll check to see that our month check is looking good in terms of number of arguments and parentheses lining up. We can see that with the little orange highlights here. And now for our consequent, we'll supply the revenue value. Finally, for our alternative, we'll supply a 0. Now that our function's complete, let's go ahead and execute that report. And this time we'll just jump right to the end page here so we can see what that full calculation looks like. And so here, our revenue from June of 2018 for the month to date is going to be $32,062.30. If we navigate back to our designer, we can go into that function once again, and instead of supplying a true value, we can use false. And now this should give us the full calculation for all of June 2018. If we jump all the way to the end, we can see that we see a slight bump in the revenue numbers here. So at this point, we've come to the conclusion of the prepped content for today's lab. We hope you guys were able to get some content out of this lab. And as we mentioned, all of the custom functions that we've seen here, the year-to-date check, last year-to-date check, and month check, are already available on our support site under the custom functions section of the how-to guides. So please feel free to check those out and use that code in your Exago implementations if you'd like. We're going to hang around for another couple minutes just to answer any last-minute questions you folks might have. And as always, happy reporting.